the hunger of the last winter had a taste. It tasted of boiled shoe leather and the bitter broth of pine needles. For Martha, it was the metallic tang of anxiety that lived permanently on her tongue. For Beatrice, it was the hollow ache in her gut that no amount of thin, watery soup could ever truly fill. At 18, the twin sisters had already survived more winters of scarcity than they cared to count, each one seeming to shave a little more hope from the small, isolated valley they called home. The community of Redemption Creek was hardy, but hardiness did not fill a pantry. Every spring was a promise, every summer a frantic race of planting and harvesting, and every autumn a prayer that this year, finally, there would be enough. There never was. The previous February had been the worst. They remembered the silence that had fallen over the town, a quiet born not of peace but of lethargy. They remembered the pinched, grey faces of their neighbors and the sight of old Mr. Gable, a man who had once wrestled a bear, weeping quietly on his porch as his wife's coughing grew weaker inside. Their own father, Samuel, had grown gaunt, his large frame shrinking within his worn clothes, always insisting his daughters eat the last of the salted pork while he made do with whatever was left. The memory was a fresh wound, a ghost that haunted their every waking thought as the new season's warmth began to settle over the land. They couldn't face another winter like that. They wouldn't. While others saw the green shoots of corn as a sign of temporary plenty, Martha and Beatrice saw only a countdown, a clock ticking inexorably toward the first frost. The problem, as they saw it, was preservation. Their small, leaky smokehouse could handle a pig or two, a few deer, but it was inefficient, a squat little shack that wasted more smoke than it used. It couldn't possibly process enough meat to see a family of 3, let alone a community, through 5 months of relentless snow and ice. They needed something more. Something better. The idea began not with a grand vision, but with the simple observation of smoke. One cool evening, Martha stood watching the thin, grey curl rising from their chimney. It rose straight and true, a column of heat and scent climbing toward the vast, indifferent sky. She watched how it billowed when the wind caught it, but its essential nature was to go up. Always up. Their smokehouse, by contrast, was a low, flat building. The smoke filled it haphazardly, lazy and thick, often smothering the fire or failing to circulate properly, leaving some cuts of meat overly blackened while others remained dangerously undercured. It was a horizontal solution to a vertical problem. "It's wrong," she murmured, her voice so low that Beatrice, mending a pair of trousers beside her on the porch steps, barely heard. "What's wrong?" Beatrice asked, not looking up from her needlework. She was the more practical of the two, her mind always grounded in the mechanics of how things worked. Martha was the dreamer, the one who saw patterns in the clouds. "The smokehouse," Martha said, her gaze still fixed on the chimney. "We push the smoke sideways. But it wants to go up. We're fighting it. What if we didn't fight it? What if we built something tall?" Beatrice finally looked up, her needle poised in midair. She followed her sister's gaze to the chimney, then back to the squat shack near the edge of their property. A flicker of understanding crossed her face. For days, they spoke of nothing else. They walked the property, pacing out dimensions in the dirt. Martha drew sketches with a charred stick on a piece of smooth birch bark, her lines fluid and imaginative. She envisioned a tall, round structure, like a stone silo, with a fire pit at the bottom and racks for the meat extending all the way to the top. Beatrice, ever the engineer, refined the idea. She added a second, smaller opening near the base for controlling the airflow and a clever system of baffles made from flat stones to help distribute the smoke evenly. It would need to be built of stone, for durability and to hold the heat. It would need a roof of slate or tile to keep out the rain and snow. It would be a tower. A tower for making meat. The plan was audacious, born of desperation and youthful conviction. It was a structure unlike anything anyone in Redemption Creek had ever seen, a monument to a future they were determined to create, one where winter was not a predator waiting to devour them. They chose a spot behind the cabin, on a patch of high, dry ground. The first step was to present their plan to their father. Samuel sat at the small kitchen table, his large, work-roughened hands wrapped around a cup of chicory coffee, and listened. He looked from Martha's enthusiastic face to Beatrice's serious one, his expression a mixture of love and deep, weary skepticism. He studied the crude drawing on the birch bark, tracing the outline of the tower with a calloused finger. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the mantel clock. "A tower," he finally said, his voice gravelly. "Girls, we have fences to mend, a field to plough, and wood to chop for the coming winter. We don't have time for building castles. It's not a castle, Pa," Beatrice said patiently. "It's a machine. A vertical smokehouse. It'll be more efficient. We can cure 4 times the meat in the same amount of time," Martha chimed in, her voice full of passion. "Think of it, Pa, enough bacon to last until May. Enough jerky that we won't have to ration it a strip at a time. We won't have to watch our neighbors starve." The mention of their neighbors struck a chord, and a flicker of pain crossed Samuel's face. He knew they were right about the need. But the execution seemed impossible. "And what will you build this tower with? Dreams? Where are you getting the stone? The slate for the roof? This is a massive undertaking. It'll take all summer, and for what? An experiment that might not even work. We'll get the stones from the creek bed," Beatrice stated simply. "And we can make our own tiles from the clay pit near the river. We've watched the potters do it. It's just mud and fire." Samuel sighed, a deep, rattling sound of a man who had seen too many hopeful plans crushed by the harsh realities of the land. "People will talk," he warned. "They'll think we've lost our senses." He was right. Word of the project spread through Redemption Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. Mr. Henderson, the portly owner of the general store, chuckled as he weighed out flour for a customer. "Heard Samuel's girls are building a tower to heaven," he said, loud enough for half the store to hear. Mrs. Gable, the town's primary source of news and gossip, was less amused and more critical. Wasting good daylight on such foolishness, she clucked to her circle of friends. Should be mending clothes and learning to keep a proper house, not hauling rocks like a pair of mules. It's unnatural. The name was coined by a group of farmhands who passed the sisters' property on their way to the fields. Seeing the circular foundation of stones taking shape, one of them yelled out, "What you building there, girls?" "A meat tower." The name stuck, repeated with condescending smirks in the store and whispered behind hands at Sunday service. The Vermeet Tower became a symbol of the twins' strange obsession, a folly that the whole town could watch with detached amusement, waiting for it to fail. The ridicule stung, but it also hardened their resolve. Every dismissive laugh was another stone laid on their foundation, every whispered doubt another bucket of mortar mixed. The work was brutal, far harder than they had imagined. They rose before the sun, their muscles aching from the previous day's labor, and made their way to the creek. They waded into the cold, rushing water, searching for stones that were flat and wide, stacking them on a crude wooden sledge their father had built them years ago. They hauled the sledge back up the steep bank, their shoulders straining, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Their hands, once smooth, became a landscape of cuts, calluses, and blisters. Samuel, despite his vocal reservations, could not stand to watch them struggle alone. He never admitted the project had merit, but his action spoke louder than his words. In the evenings, after his own long day in the fields, he would appear at the building site. "That one looks too heavy for you," he would grunt, effortlessly lifting a massive cornerstone into place that the two of them together had failed to budge. He never stayed long, and he never offered praise, but his silent, powerful assistance was an unspoken blessing. They mixed the mortar from clay, water, and dried grass, stomping it with their bare feet until it reached the perfect consistency. The tower rose slowly, ring by agonizing ring. It was not a beautiful structure. The stones were irregular, the mortar lines uneven. It looked ancient and crude, something unearthed rather than built. The neighbors' mockery did not cease. It became a part of the valley's daily rhythm, like the crowing of the rooster or the ringing of the church bell. But as the tower grew taller, a subtle shift began to occur. The laughter became a little quieter. The dismissive glances were replaced by longer, more curious stares. People would find excuses to walk their horses a little slower as they passed the property, their eyes tracing the impossible height of the stone structure. What had begun as a joke was becoming a reality, a strange, stubborn monument rising from the earth. The sisters worked in a world of their own, fueled by a shared, unspoken vision. They learned the language of the stones, how to fit a jagged edge against a smooth one, how to balance the weight to create a stable wall. They were no longer just Martha and Beatrice, they were builders, engineers, architects of their own survival. The tower became an extension of their will, its rough, stony exterior a perfect reflection of their own unyielding determination. By late summer, the main structure was complete, standing a formidable 12 feet tall and 5 feet wide. It was a solid, windowless cylinder of grey and brown stone, looking more like a defensive turret than a smokehouse. Now came the most critical part, the interior mechanics and the first test. Beatrice, using her knack for practical design, supervised the installation of the racks. They had spent weeks cutting and seasoning hickory poles, which they now fitted into gaps left in the stonework, creating a ladder of rungs that ascended the entire height of the tower's interior. At the base, they carefully constructed a fire pit, offset from the center and connected to a small, stone-lined trench that led to an adjustable vent on the outer wall. This, Beatrice explained, was the key to controlling the temperature. A direct fire would be too hot, cooking the meat. They needed a slow, cool smoke. Their first trial was a small one, a few strips of venison from a young buck their father had brought down. They built a small, smoldering fire of hickory chips in the pit, the sweet, pungent smoke filling the stone chamber. With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, they hung the strips on the lowest rungs and sealed the heavy wooden door they had constructed. For 2 days, they tended the fire, never letting it get too hot, never letting it go out. They took turns sleeping in short shifts, their senses attuned to the slightest change in the wind or the smell of the smoke. On the 3rd day, they decided it was time. When they opened the door, a plume of cool, fragrant smoke washed over them. Their hearts sank. The venison was not the deep, rich mahogany they had hoped for. It was streaked with black soot, and a single bite revealed the taste of creosote. The smoke had been too thick, too dirty. "We failed," Martha whispered, the disappointment a physical weight in her chest. Beatrice, however, was already analyzing the problem. She pointed to the lack of a proper chimney. "The smoke is just sitting in there," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It has nowhere to go. It needs to flow. It needs to be drawn upwards." Over the meat the setback was demoralizing, but they refused to be defeated. They spent the next week carefully dismantling the top few layers of stone and constructing a narrow flue, a chimney that extended another 3 feet above the main structure. They also added a series of small, adjustable vents around the base, giving them even finer control over the airflow. Their second test, with another small batch of meat, was a resounding success. The meat was perfect, dry to the touch, deeply colored, and infused with a clean, sweet hickory flavor that was nothing short of miraculous. They had done it. Their machine worked. As the first golden leaves of autumn began to fall, the real work began. The harvest this year had been bountiful, and they had traded corn and potatoes for 2 large hogs from a neighboring farm. Samuel, his skepticism now almost entirely replaced by a quiet, burgeoning pride, proved to be an expert butcher. The 3 of them worked for days, their hands slick and stained, their kitchen transformed into a production line of incredible efficiency. They cut thick slabs of belly for bacon, trimmed shoulders for curing, and sliced lean muscle into thin, uniform strips for jerky. Every piece was methodically rubbed with a mixture of salt, sugar, and spices, then left to cure in large wooden barrels in the cool darkness of the root cellar. When the curing was complete, the true purpose of the tower was realized. They loaded it from top to bottom. Dozens of slabs of bacon, long ropes of sausage, and countless strips of venison and beef hung from the hickory rungs, a magnificent, meaty tapestry filling the stone cylinder. The tower, which had looked so stark and empty, was now pregnant with promise, filled with the sum of their summer's labor and a season's worth of hope. They lit the hickory fire, and for the next 2 weeks, a steady, almost sacred plume of white smoke rose from the tower's chimney. It became the new landmark of their homestead. The scent of it drifted across the valley, an aromatic announcement of their success. It was a smell of abundance, of preparation, of defiance against the coming cold. Their neighbors, who had grown accustomed to mocking the tower's construction, now fell silent. They watched the constant smoke with a new, unsettling feeling. It was a mixture of curiosity, envy, and for some, a dawning sense of their own unpreparedness. The joke was no longer funny. The meat tower was no longer a folly. It was a fortress, and its walls were filled with food. The sisters had done exactly what they had set out to do, and the sheer scale of their success was impossible to ignore. The quiet hum of activity at the twins' homestead stood in stark contrast to the rest of Redemption Creek, where the usual, frantic pace of autumn preparation felt, for the first time, somehow inadequate. When the smoking was finally finished, the day of the unveiling felt like a sacred holiday. Samuel and the sisters stood before the heavy wooden door, a shared look of nervous anticipation on their faces. With a deep breath, Beatrice heaved the door open. The sight that greeted them was breathtaking. The interior of the tower glowed with a warm, dark light, the stone walls seasoned by weeks of smoke. Hanging in orderly rows were hundreds of pounds of perfectly preserved meat. The bacon was a deep, burnished red, the venison jerky a dark, almost black mahogany. The air that flowed out was cool and dry, carrying a scent so rich and profound it was almost intoxicating, a complex perfume of salt, hickory smoke, and cured meat. They worked together to unload their bounty, piece by precious piece. They wrapped the bacon in muslin cloth, tied the jerky into bundles with twine, and laid the cured hams in wooden crates packed with straw. Their small root cellar, which had always seemed cavernously empty by midwinter, was now filled to capacity. The shelves groaned under the weight of their foresight. There was more food than the three of them could possibly eat in a single winter, or even two. They had not just prepared, they had created a surplus, an island of security in a world of perpetual scarcity. That evening, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, fat, wet flakes that melted on the warm earth but signaled the definitive end of autumn. As the family sat down to a supper of fresh bread and the first sampling of their bacon, crisp, salty, and smoky, a profound sense of peace settled over them. They had faced down the ghost of winters past. They had looked at the seemingly immutable cycle of hardship and, through sheer force of will and ingenuity, had broken it. Outside, the snow began to stick, blanketing the valley in a soft, silent layer of white. But for the first time in their lives, the sight did not fill them with dread. It was just weather. Inside their small cabin, warmed by the fire and the security of a full larder, they were safe. They had built their fortress not just of stone, but of intelligence and hard work, and it would see them through the darkness. The winter of that year descended upon Redemption Creek with a particular fury. It came early and stayed late, a relentless siege of snow and ice. Blizzard swept through the valley, piling drifts as high as rooftops and cutting off the town from the outside world for weeks at a time. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that seeped through the chinks in log cabins and stole the warmth from hearths. By January, the predictable pattern of scarcity had begun. The initial stores of harvested vegetables dwindled. The sacks of flour and cornmeal grew lighter. The small caches of salted fish and poorly cured meats were exhausted. The laughter and gossip that had once filled Mr. Henderson's store were replaced by a grim, anxious silence. His shelves grew barer each day, and the credit he could extend was stretched to its breaking point. At the Gable household, the mood was dire. Their small smokehouse had yielded its usual meager bounty, which was gone by Christmas. Now, their meals were thin soups made from dried beans and the last of their potatoes. Mrs. Gable, who had been so quick to criticize the sisters' project, now spent her days staring out the window, her face a mask of worry. Her husband was growing weaker, and the hollow-eyed look of her children was a constant, stabbing pain in her heart. The meat tower, once a subject of public amusement, was now a source of private agony for many. The memory of that steady, fragrant plume of smoke haunted them. They had laughed at the sisters' industry, confident in their own traditional, and ultimately inadequate, methods. Now, as hunger gnawed at their bellies and fear gnawed at their souls, that stone tower on the hill loomed in their minds, a silent, unmoving testament to their own short-sightedness. It was no longer a folly, it was an accusation. It represented a security they had dismissed, an opportunity they had failed to grasp. The valley grew quiet, the deep snow muffling sound and isolating families in their own bubbles of hardship. The cheerful greetings of neighbors were replaced with curt nods, no one wanting to reveal the true depth of their desperation, yet everyone knowing the truth of the other's suffering. The community was fraying at the seams, held together only by a shared, unspoken misery. The breaking point came in early February. A new wave of blizzards buried the valley under another 3 feet of snow, and a sickness, born of cold and malnutrition, began to spread. It struck the children and the elderly first. The Gables' youngest son, a boy of 6, was gravely ill, his small body racked with a feverish cough, too weak to even cry. There was no medicine to be had, and more importantly, no nourishing food to give him the strength to fight. The news reached Samuel and his daughters through a neighbor who had struggled through the drifts to borrow a small amount of lamp oil. The man's face was etched with despair as he told them about the boy's condition. That night, the atmosphere in the sisters' warm, well-stocked cabin was heavy. They ate their meal of smoked sausage and potatoes in silence, the taste of their own security suddenly bitter in their mouths. Finally, Samuel pushed his plate away. He looked at Martha, then at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a deep, solemn pride. "It's time," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What we have is not just for us." The sisters needed no further prompting. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. They rose from the table and went to the root cellar. By the light of a lantern, they began to assemble the first of many packages. They took down slabs of bacon, bundles of jerky, and links of sausage. They worked with a quiet, determined efficiency, wrapping the precious meat in clean muslin. They were not just packing food, they were packing hope. The next morning, they bundled themselves in their warmest clothes and stepped out into a world of blinding white. The snow was waist-deep in places, the air so cold it burned their lungs. Martha carried a large, heavy sack over her shoulder, and Beatrice carried another. They did not speak, their shared purpose a silent bond between them. Their first stop was the Gable house. When they knocked, it took a long time for the door to open. Mr. Gable stood there, a shadow of his former self, his eyes hollow with shame and suspicion. Behind him, they could hear the child's weak, rattling cough. Mrs. Gable appeared, her face pale and drawn. She stared at the sisters, then at the heavy sacks they carried, her expression a painful mix of pride and desperation. "We've brought something for the boy," Martha said softly, her voice gentle. A strong broth might help. She held out a package of rich, fatty bacon and a bundle of venison. For a moment, no one moved. The Gables simply stared, unable to process the generosity of the 2 young women they had so openly mocked. Then, a sob escaped Mrs. Gable's lips. It was a raw, broken sound that seemed to carry all the pain and fear of the long winter. We don't have anything to trade," Mr. Gable stammered, his voice cracking. Beatrice shook her head. "We're not here to trade. We're neighbors." That single act of generosity cracked the frozen shell of Redemption Creek's despair. From the Gables' home, the sisters continued their journey, their tracks in the deep snow marking a path of hope through the desolate landscape. They went from cabin to cabin, leaving a portion of their winter stores at each one. They visited the Hendersons, where the storekeeper, his usual bluster gone, accepted their gift with tears in his eyes. They visited families they barely knew, their faces all showing the same signs of hardship and hunger. At each stop, they were met with the same initial shock, the same shamefaced disbelief, followed by an overwhelming, often tearful, gratitude. They asked for nothing in return. Their message was simple, delivered through their actions rather than words: we are a community, and we will survive this together. The meat they shared was more than just sustenance. It was a lifeline. Broth made from the smoky bacon gave strength to the sick. The protein-rich jerky filled the bellies of hungry children. For the first time in months, the smell of cooking meat, a scent of life and vitality, began to drift from the chimneys of Redemption Creek. The food lifted not only their physical strength but also their spirits. The knowledge that they were not alone, that someone had prepared and was willing to share, reignited a sense of communal hope that the brutal winter had nearly extinguished. The sisters became quiet legends. The meat tower, once a symbol of their eccentricity, was transformed into a beacon of salvation. People spoke of the girls in hushed, reverent tones. They had not just been clever, they had been wise. They had not just been industrious, they had been generous. They had seen the storm coming while everyone else was enjoying the sunshine, and instead of hoarding their security, they had shared it freely, saving the very people who had once laughed at them. Samuel watched his daughters with a pride so immense it felt as if his heart would burst. They had done more than just build a stone tower, they had rebuilt the foundations of their community, mortaring it with kindness and compassion. The harsh winter continued its assault, but its power over the town was broken. The hunger had been vanquished, not by a single hero, but by the foresight and grace of two determined young women. When the spring thaw finally came, melting the mountains of snow and revealing the muddy, sleeping earth beneath, it felt like a true resurrection. The people of Redemption Creek emerged from their cabins, blinking in the bright sunlight, thinner and wearier, but alive. They had survived. They owed their survival to Martha and Beatrice, and they knew it. The social fabric of the valley had been rewoven. The old lines of gossip and judgment had been replaced with threads of gratitude and respect. The first person to visit the sisters' homestead was Mr. Henderson. He came not as a cynical storekeeper but as a humbled man, his hat in his hands. I came to apologize, he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. And to ask, how did you do it? How did you build that thing? Martha and Beatrice, without a moment's hesitation, took him to the tower. They explained the principles of airflow, the importance of a slow, cool smoke, the design of the chimney and vents. They held nothing back. Beatrice drew diagrams in the dirt, showing him the construction details, while Martha explained their process for curing the meat. They shared their knowledge as freely as they had shared their food. Soon, others followed. Mr. Gable came, then other farmers and homesteaders, all with the same question on their lips. Each time, the sisters patiently explained their design, their process, their failures, and their ultimate success. Their meat tower ceased to be their private invention and became a piece of public knowledge, a new technology for the whole community. That autumn, the valley looked different. Alongside the traditional, squat smokehouses, new structures began to rise. They were smaller, cruder versions of the original, but they were built on the same principles. The sight of neighbors helping each other haul stones, of men who had once mocked the sisters now trying to replicate their work, was a profound testament to the legacy they had created. As the leaves turned and the air grew crisp, a half-dozen new plumes of hickory smoke began to rise into the sky, joining the one that still ascended from the original tower. They were a collective signal of preparation, a unified statement of defiance against the winter that would inevitably come. The sisters had not just saved their neighbors from one harsh season, they had given them the means to save themselves for all the seasons to come. Their legacy was not written in a book or carved on a monument. It was written in stone and smoke, in full pantries and the grateful faces of their community, a lasting tribute to the power of a good idea and a generous heart.